We move on to Mr. Myers.
Hi, first I want to welcome both of you to Alvernia. I've got a couple questions I want to try to get to on the issue of energy and energy independence. About 10 years ago, the state enacted a law called the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard, which required utilities to purchase alternative energy, wind and solar power. And it had the consequence of making Pennsylvania a national leader in both those areas. They've achieved those goals. Would you consider supporting a piece of legislation that would expand those requirements and require the utilities to purchase more alternative energy? And why don't we start with Mr. Saar?
Yeah, Dave, thank you. I would support that type of legislation, and here's why. Energy independence is the one aspect of state government that actually has national security implications. And we're not going to solve national security crisis here in the state of Pennsylvania, or national security challenges, let me correct that, in the state of Pennsylvania, but we can help the country go a long way. One of the things I saw as serving in the Army is I served as an Arabic linguist and intelligence analyst. My role was to help understand the threats we faced and the enemy we had. And I can tell you, it's not a Republican or a Democratic issue. Service members know, and I know we have veterans in here, that what weighs down our policy when it comes to national security is our inability to be energy independent. And unfortunately, we can't get everything we can from oil and gas. And this is actually an economic development issue too, because there are companies in Lancaster and other parts of the state that have thriving jobs, whether it's in solar or wind or other parts of alternative energy industry. But I think we need to go in that direction because it's a national security issue and it's a jobs issue.
Minute and a half.
The problem with an approach like that is it's another instance of picking winners and losers. Rather than letting the economy dictate and the free market dictate where sources come from, I'd love to see us drilling for Marcellus shale more. We have a structure now in place that we would receive impact fees. The problem is natural gas has become all too plentiful, so the drillers have backed off on the level of drilling. We have a lot of natural resources in Pennsylvania and around the country. Unfortunately, there are those who oppose drilling, whether it's for oil or expansion of coal mines, et cetera. We've got a lot of natural resources that are already proven, and we've got a lot of government hurdles against it. I'm for removing those hurdles. And again, when you look at something like the expansion of the solar or wind-powered energy and requiring electric companies to purchase alternative sources of energy, quite often those sources of energy are more expensive, and they don't eat the costs of that. They pass those costs directly on to the consumer. Quite often the consumer is you and I as a homeowner. More often than not, they also pass that on to businesses, and businesses are our employers. As a business pays more and more in paying for their electric and so forth, higher taxes for implementation and enforcement, the more burden we have on businesses, the fewer employees they can hire. And so that creates the environment where we've got people who aren't working, but we've got good use of wind and solar energy. The problem is not that we need more of that, we need the free market to dictate how much of it we use.
Mr. Cox had mentioned that the government shouldn't pick winners and losers, but when it comes to this issue in energy, unfortunately, it already happens, right? The oil and gas industry already has all these tax incentives that you want to deny to alternative energy folks that can be employers for our county. We know that exists. Where's the legislation, Mr. Cox, to remove those tax incentives and all of those giveaways to oil and gas companies that we have? It's non-existent. He's AWOL on this issue. So it's inconsistent to, on one hand, say that government shouldn't pick winners and losers, but when it comes to say, hey, we want to provide solar jobs for folks down the street, good manufacturing jobs that require a good 2-year technical education, to say, no, we shouldn't give them a tax incentive when our whole energy industry has been built on providing incentives over and over and over again for oil and gas companies so they can rightly create the energy we need. This is just another example of us saying we need to help build this industry. Tax incentives are a smart way to do that.
1 minute.
It's a fairly simple concept. When government grows, when taxes increase, when costs are passed on to the consumer, it becomes more and more difficult for the consumer, for the homeowner, the business. They can't function on a daily basis as the amount of checks they're writing exceeds their income. We've got to avoid he's tossing blame at me. A lot of what he's calling for are federal issues. We don't control a lot of what happens with the drilling offshore. We don't control a lot of the other instances. If I were a congressman, I probably would draft and co-sponsor legislation that would accomplish some of those goals. But the larger issue on the energy resources, it's largely a federal issue, and we as a state are fairly limited in what we can do. We can control what happens on state game lands and state-owned lands. But when it all boils down, there's a difficulty in placing the blame at the state level when in fact it's a federal barrier that's been put in place. I do regularly encourage our congressmen and our senators to take down those walls, but like you, I'm just their constituent.
Mr. Myers, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. The issue of Marcellus shale is raised, which is also an energy issue. And the General Assembly passed and the governor signed an act that was very controversial. I wonder if both of you could speak about how you feel about that act, particularly some of the environmental protections in it, but more specifically about the decision to make a impact fee rather than a severance tax.
Is it me first?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks,
I started
Dave.
with
It's
you.
it's a critical issue because, and I know Mr. Cox has mentioned before, we don't have Marcellus shale that we know of here in Berks County, but it's an important state issue. And I'll tell you one of the things we did, and it's one of the sad parts of politics when you look at how much money is involved in donations from gas companies to the current representatives, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, including my opponent. And you see, we enacted the lowest impact fee of any state in the nation. It's lower than Texas. It's lower than West Virginia. These are conservative states, right? One of the things we could have done with a higher impact fee, which is why I think my opponent's disingenuous when it comes to property tax relief. There was a bill to say, let's make that fee more in line with the next lowest state, West Virginia. And we're going to direct that money straight to the rent rebate program. My opponent opposed that bill. So it's an important issue, and unfortunately we went about it the wrong way, and we're going to have to rectify that, make it more fair, because there's other issues at play too. The environmental protections that were there are practically non-existent. And one of the biggest things, the big government solution you voted for that was in that bill, was to say, you know what, Harrisburg's going to say, if a gas company comes your way in Spring Township or Lower Heidelberg Township and says we're going to drill, Harrisburg passed a law that said, you know what, local control, gone when it comes to this issue. And it's wrong. It's hard to defend a small government approach when all these answers from Harrisburg say Harrisburg's going to tell you how to do it. And now local control doesn't mean anything when it comes to gas. We can't even protect our own environment. You can't have any legislation at the local level to say this is how we want to regulate this because Harrisburg's taken it over.
Mr. Sicher, we're back around to you. Round two. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
He gets a chance, I think, to respond.
Please respond. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple of things I want to add to that.
I'd be surprised if you didn't.
Mr. Saar talks about, in a previous question he answered and said, you know, we help create jobs with tax credits. Tax credits are essentially a way of selectively reducing a business tax for a select group of individuals or businesses. And so he argues that we should use tax credits, and yet the approach that we're looking to do on keeping the Marcellus shale impact fee was to allow them to come in and create the jobs, let the businesses get moving before we strangle them to death with regulations and with taxes or impact fees. The goal was to allow them to come in. If you look closer at the legislation that we passed, there is a graduated, as the production increases on the wells, the impact fee increases as well. And so it was a way to allow those fledgling businesses to continue to grow and to employ people, which I think we can all agree is a good thing. And so when you look at that, we have to do something that affects everybody equally. That same uniformity is one of the reasons we looked at the townships and the boroughs. There were hundreds of different agreements entered into by townships and boroughs all around the Commonwealth. And so for the sake of uniformity of the businesses that were coming in to do the drilling, we said, you know what, we're going to take this and even it out, and so everybody knows what they're dealing with. We did the same thing with the Uniform Construction Code years ago. That's not to say that those uniform approaches that they're the silver bullet, but the idea is to let individuals know, let companies know that when I cross from one township to another or one borough to another, I'm not going to have a different law to deal with.
Would you like a rebuttal?
I would like one rebuttal because when it comes to this issue, you know, one of the perfect examples of saying, hey, these Marcellus shale folks have come in the northern part of the state, out west, all over, and they have provided a few jobs. And you would think it would be something we would say, look, we need to encourage all these Pennsylvania jobs, and I support the drilling as long as it's done in a responsible way. So I'm not out there saying let's not drill. It's a resource that can help us be energy secure. But I also support, as we've talked about a few times now, tax credits that encourage hiring. So that's why I was stunned when my opponent voted in favor of a bill. So Jesse White, a representative out in Pittsburgh who has drilling, introduced a bill a few weeks ago that said, look, and he worked on it for years. He said, we want to encourage these drillers to hire Pennsylvania workers because we know that if you travel throughout the parts of the state where they have it, that these are folks coming from out of state. So when Representative White said, I want to give, if you commit to 75% Pennsylvanians working in your company, you get a solid tax credit from the state of Pennsylvania. My opponent opposed this. He opposed jobs for Pennsylvanians, and it's wrong. It's common sense legislation.
Representative Cox?
I don't know that not co-sponsoring an effort is necessarily considered opposition. A lot of times there are bills introduced that you don't even learn about until the process moves along. A lot of times amendments are introduced on the House floor, and what we've seen a lot lately is the minority party will take, and Mr. Representative White is in the minority party, a lot of times they'll take a bill that they have and they'll put it onto an unrelated bill, and they'll say, hey, we want to have this amendment voted on, yes or no, and a lot of times it's unrelated. Our Supreme Court has time and time again in the last 10 years, they've begun to really put a damper on mixing the subject matter of bills. And so as a legislature, we have become increasingly cautious about what types of things we combine together. So of the hundreds of amendments offered on the different bills, I can't recall all of the votes that I've cast, unfortunately. The concept, a lot of times, I'm for, but a lot of times the environment or the way in which it's being done is just something I can't support.